Getting the length of an array in JavaScript has a few curveballs to it. First off, the length property of an array does not necessarily reflect the number of non-empty elements in the array. You can actually set the array length to a different number to make it bigger or smaller. If you make it smaller, elements on the end are cut off to fit the new length number. If you make the array bigger, you will have empty elements on the end of the array. Empty elements equal undefined until you set them to be something. Finally, if you just ask for the length property, it will give it back, which will be the normal happy path. Concat is an array function in JavaScript that joins two or more arrays together to form a new array. It doesn't change any of the existing arrays, it returns a new array. Here you have two arrays, you join them together with concat, and end up with a new array that has the elements of both arrays joined together. The only thing to worry about with the concat function is that it doesn't flatten out arrays that are more than one level deep. In this case, because array B was 2 levels deep, it was added to the C array as an entire 1D array, rather than all of B's elements being in the array individually. CopyWithin is an array function in JavaScript that moves elements around within an existing array. You have this array 1, 2, 3. You call copyWithin with 0, then 1. Within the code, the whole step of copying is a single step. To understand it practically, it's better to conceptualize it as the element at the index of the second argument is moved to the index of the first argument. Then the element at the next index after the argument is moved to one index after the first argument, and so on until the last element can be moved. In this case, although the copy happens in one step in the code, the conceptual understanding would be 2 gets copied to where 1 is at, then 3 gets copied to where 2 is at, then there's no more copies to do, so the array is done being modified. The key thing to remember here is, because you've only specified 2 arguments, the second argument conceptually keeps getting incremented by 1 until no more copies can be made to the next available slot. When you have this same array but specify 3 arguments to copy within, the third argument specifies the first argument to exclude from the copying. So if you were to call copyWithin with the arguments 0, 1, and 2, the copying would stop at index 2, meaning the 3 wouldn't get copied into where the 2 is in the original array. Fill is an array function in JavaScript that replaces every element in an existing array with a single value. Let's say for whatever reason you want to replace every item in this array with zeros. That would be the simplest use of the fill function. Call fill on this array and pass in 0, and it will modify A, making it an array of all zeros instead of holding 1, 2, and 3. Say you only want to start filling the very same array with zeros starting at the second element. It works very similarly. You just pass in the 0 and the index of the second element, which is 1. If you didn't already know, the index of the first element in an array is 0, so that makes the index of the second element 1. Now this one you'll hate. Say you only want to change 1 through 3 and keep 4 unchanged. You know what you have to pass in to fill? You still pass in the 0, and you pass in another 0 representing the index to start at, but the kicker is you have to pass in 3 as the last index. This is because providing a third order argument to fill isn't the index of the last element to change, it's the index of the first element to exclude. Find is an array function in JavaScript that calls a function on each array element in order and returns a first element in which the function returns true. You have an array with 1, 2, 3. You have a function that tells whether or not the number you pass in was even. When you pass even into find, it returns 2 because that's the first even number. You have an array with -1, -2, and 3. You have a function that tells whether or not the number you passed in was positive. When you pass pos into find, it returns 3 because that's the first positive number. findIndex is an array function in JavaScript that returns the index of the first element in the array that satisfies the condition of the function you pass in. You have an array with 1, 2, 3. You have a function that tells whether or not the number you passed in was even. When you pass even into findIndex, it returns the 1 because that's the index of the first even number. You have an array with -1, -2, and 3. You have a function that tells whether or not the number you passed in was positive. When you pass pos into findIndex, it returns 2 because that's the index of the first positive number. lastIndexOf is an array function in JavaScript that returns the index of the last occurrence of an element in an array. The utility of lastIndexOf becomes evident when you have an array like this. You can find the index of the last occurrence of 2 in the array, so you call lastIndexOf on A and pass in 2. When you do that, you end up getting back 2 because that's the index of the last occurrence of 2. Passing in a second argument to lastIndexOf actually gives you a deeper lens into how the function works. Say you call lastIndexOf on this array and pass in 2 and then another 2. lastIndexOf doesn't work by searching left to right and then ignoring matches it finds until the end of the array. Thinking about this conceptually, it would be impossible for the function to work like that because it would have to know the future to know which find to not ignore that will be the last one in the array. How the function works is it starts all the way on the right side of the array and then returns the index of the first occurrence of the element you're looking for. It's a bit weird to think about, but the first occurrence of the element starting from the end of the array is the last occurrence of the element. So when you specify the second 2, that determines where to start the search for the element, and then from there, the search continues to go backwards, meaning this would return 1. Pop is a function that removes the last item from the array. The pop function doesn't return the new array. Don't set your array to the output value of pop, otherwise you'll lose the array. Beware! Calling pop on an empty array doesn't give you an error. Check if the length of the array is 0 to see if it is an empty array. The array push method in JavaScript adds an element or elements at the end of the array. The new length of the array is returned from the function. Here you're storing the new length of the array in a variable. When you print out the variable, since you went from a length of 3 to 4, 4 will be printed. This sets up an error you need to make sure you avoid. Don't set your array variable to the output of the push function because this will store the new length over where your array was stored and you no longer be able to access the array. You can simply just pass multiple elements into push separated by a comma and they will all be added to the end of the array, one by one, in order. Finally, if you pass in just a single element to push, that single element will be added to the end of the array. Reverse is an array method in JavaScript that modifies the existing array by returning it, meaning the last element is now the first element and the first element is now the last element. I know this is riveting content that you're absolutely not expecting the outcome of. If you call reverse on this initial array, it ends up mutating the array, and the array is now reversed, being in the order of 3, 2, 1 when you print it out. The array unshift method in JavaScript adds an element or elements to the start of the array. It returns the new length of the array, not the new array itself. That point that it returns the new length of the array creates a potential error you need to avoid. When you're modifying your array, don't set the array to the output value of unshift, or else the new length will overwrite your array and you'll no longer have access to the array. With unshift, inserting multiple elements will give you a different output than inserting those same elements on multiple lines one after another. Here, the 1, 2, and 3 are inserted right before the 4 as a straight line chunk. Inserting the same elements over multiple lines gives you a completely different array of 3, 2, 1, 4. In the happy path, just inserting one element works like you would expect. The 1 gets inserted before the 2 and the array becomes 1, 2. Shift is a function that removes the first item from the array. Since shift returns the new length of the array after the item is removed and not the new array, avoid setting the array to the output of the shift function. If you don't avoid this, you lose the original array. You should also know that shift doesn't give you an error if you call it on an empty array. To check if the array is empty, you can check if its length is 0. Here, doing shift on the array 1, 2, 3 removes the first element and leaves you with the array 2, 3. And here, doing shift on the array containing only 1 leaves you with an empty array. Slice is an array function in JavaScript that returns a portion of the array. We'll cover the simplest example first. Say you have this array A, and then slice it while passing nothing into slice. This ends up making a shallow copy of A. Meaning if you're dealing with this example here, then it's no big deal. However, if you have something like an array with 2 people objects in it, say one named Bob and one named Joe, if you use slice to copy C into D, then changing Bob in one of them would change Bob in both C and D. Let's say you have this subsection of the prime numbers, and let's say you want to correct the mistake and leave out 1 because it isn't prime. We'll make a variable and call it actual primes. If you want every element from the second number onwards, you pass in a 1 to slice. This may seem counterintuitive, but the idea when you pass in 1 as a number to slice is you're passing in the first index to include. Since arrays start the index 0, the index of the second element is 1. As a positive though, passing in negative numbers to slice gets you a bit more of an intuitive output. Say you want the last 2 of actual primes, just pass in -2. It's that easy. If you're disappointed by the last one being unintuitive, you'll be really devastated at this one. You want A through C in this array? You know how you have to get it? You have to slice A and pass in 0 and then 3. 0 is where you start the slice at, and 3, for whatever reason the function was made like this, is the index of the first element to exclude. So to sum up quickly, no arguments is a shallow copy, 1 argument is the index of the first element, then the rest of the array, and 2 arguments is the index to start at, and then the first index to exclude. To sort an array means to order the elements in the array from either least to greatest or greatest to least. The examples will show least to greatest. JavaScript has a built-in array method to do this called sort. Sorting letters works like you would expect. An array C, A, B gets sorted to an array of A, B, C. Sorting an array of strings works similarly. Alphabetical sorting goes on, and to break any ties, like everything starting with an A, the next letter in the string is looked at, so the array ends up being sorted to Aaron, Abe, Acadia. You'll be shocked at how a programming language could make such an idiotic design decision, but what I just described on the previous slide with the alphabetical sorting and tie breaking is exactly how sorting numbers works as well by default. So because in the system that maps all characters to numbers, 1 comes before 2, the array 11-2 gets sorted to 11-2, even though you can look at this and know it's definitely not right. To sort numeric arrays the way you most likely want to sort them, you define a custom sorting order function. This function is an optional function to pass to sort to be ran on every pair of elements in the array to compare them. To sort least greatest, your function should return a negative number if element A is less than element B, return a positive number if element A is greater than element B, and return 0 if element A and B are equal. This comp function fits the bill of exactly what I just described, so the array of 11 and 2 gets correctly sorted to 2, then 11. Splice is a JavaScript function that changes the array by removing or replacing elements from it. Here, you pass 1 and then 2 to splice. This means start at index 1 and then remove 2 elements, which is how you end up removing the last 2 elements. Something important to note, splice returns a portion of the array that you remove, not the new array. Because of that, avoid setting your array variable to the output of the splice function. Here, you pass in the same 1 and then 2 to splice to start. This still means start at index 1 and then remove 2 elements. The next 2 arguments, 3 and 5, are the numbers you will add to the array starting at the first argument's index, which would be 1 in this case. That's how you get the array 1, 3, 5. Here, you're starting at index 2, deleting no elements, and inserting the values 4 and then 8 into the array. This ends up giving you an array of the first few powers of 2. Includes is an array function in JavaScript that tells whether or not an element is in the array. Say you had this array and you wanted to know whether or not it included a 2. Call includes on the array and pass in 2. You end up getting true, meaning that this array does indeed have a 2 in it. Say you wanted to know whether or not an array had a certain element but passed a certain index. That's the intent of passing 2 arguments to includes. The second argument is the index to start the search of whether or not an element is included in that part of the array. So when you call includes on this array with 2 2s, you end up getting whether the array includes a 2 at or after the second index. So false ends up getting returned because obviously there's no 2 at or after index 2. IndexOf is an array function in JavaScript that returns the index of the first occurrence of an element in an array. Say you wanted to find the index of the number 2 in this array. You could call the indexOf method on this array and pass in 2. After that, you get back that 2 occurs at index 1. To throw a wrench into this, what if a number occurs more than once in an array like this one? First, there is a function to return the last occurrence of an element in an array. Also, though, you can specify a second argument to indexOf. Say you called indexOf on A and passed in 2 and then another 2. That would mean, find me the first occurrence of 2 in the array, starting at index 2. That would end up returning 2. Join is an array method in JavaScript that returns a new string by concatenating every element in the array separated by commas or a separator string. Here you specify no separator string, so 1, 2, and 3 are simply printed out while being separated by commas. Here you end up printing out Jenny's number. The first number is 867 and the second number is 5309. When you pass in the hyphen to join, it prints out Jenny's number, which is 8675309. ForEach is an array function in JavaScript that runs a function on every element in the array. Here you have an array and a sum variable. You define a function to take in an element and add the value of the element to total. You run forEach on the array that runs the sum function on every element in the array. Afterwards, you print out the total after the forEach call and you get 6. Here you have a simpler example. You define a print function to just print out whatever was passed in. Then you pass that print function into forEach. This prints out every element of the array as forEach calls the print function for every element in the array. For these two examples, you're probably wondering if there's a way to modify the array with forEach. There isn't with forEach, but you can with the map function. Filter is an array function in JavaScript that filters out elements from the array based on a criteria and returns a new array. Here you have an array with -1, +2, and -3. You declare a function that tells whether or not what you pass in is positive Then you call filter with that function. Filter runs a positive function on every element in the array. If an element makes the function return true, it's put in the new array. Otherwise, it is not put in the new array. That's how you end up with a new array of just 2. It's important to note from that last example that filter returns a new array and doesn't modify the array that called the function. This is different from some other array functions in JavaScript. Here, the function you define is whether or not the argument to the function is an odd number. So when you pass that into filter, the resulting array is 1 and then 3. Flat is an array function in JavaScript that reduces an array's depth. An array that's 1 level deep would just be an array of non-array elements. An array that's 2 levels deep would be an array containing 1 level deep arrays, and so on for deeper arrays. Here's an example. I have this grid of numbers, and I want to get a 1-dimensional array of every number in the grid. I can do that with the array flat function. So we'll call this 1D array nums, and set that equal to calling flat on the grid. If you pass nothing into flat, it removes 1 depth level from every element of the array. In this case, it goes into the grid and flattens out every 1D array. If you were to console log this out, you'd get your 1D array with the numbers 1 through 9 in order. In this example, you have an array of arrays, or said another way, a 3-level deep array. Let's completely flatten out this array. We'll declare a 1D array called nums again. But this time you can't just call flat because that will take this 3-level deep array down to a 2-level deep array. You can, however, pass in a number to flat that will be the number of levels or depths to remove from the array. So since you want to flatten out this array, you would call flat on the grid and pass in the number 2 to take the grid down from 3 levels deep to 1 level deep. And if you console logged this out, you would get the flattened array. Map is an array function in JavaScript that runs a function on every element in the array and then stores the returned value in a new array. Here you have an array with 1 through 3. You define a square function that returns the value that was passed into it, squared. Then you pass in the square function to map, and this makes a new array with 1, 4, and 9. This is because 1, 4, and 9 have all been squared from their original values. An important thing to note from that example, map returns a new array. So unlike some of the other array functions in JavaScript, you want to set the array variable to the output of the map function. Here, you define a function that adds 1 to every element in the array. So when you pass that into the map function, the array ends up being 2, 3, 4. Every is an array function in JavaScript that calls a function on every element in the array. If every element satisfies the condition specified in the function, then true is returned. Otherwise, false is returned. Here, there's an array with 2, 4, and 6. The even function checks whether or not the argument passed in is even. When you pass even into every, it returns true because every element in that array is even. And a slight variation of the previous example, every really does mean every. Since the single element in the array isn't even, every returns false. This one's a bit different. When the checking function has 2 arguments, the first argument is the array element and the second argument is that array element's index. So fn is asking if the element is exactly equal to 2 more than the index of the element. That's why every returns true here, because 2 is 2 greater than its index 0 and 3 is exactly 2 greater than its index 1. Sum is an array function in JavaScript that calls a function on every element in the array. If at least one element satisfies the condition specified in the function, then true is returned. Otherwise, false is returned. Here, there's an array with 1, 2, 3. The even function checks whether or not the argument you passed in is even. When you pass even into sum, it returns true because at least one element in that array is even. This one's a bit different. When the checking function has 2 arguments, the first argument is the array element and the second argument is the array element's index. So fn is asking if the element is exactly equal to 2 more than the index of the element. That's why sum returns true here, because 2 is 2 greater than its index 0, and that's at least one element returning true. Reduce is an array function in JavaScript used to process each element of an array with the goal of returning one value. You pass in a function to reduce that has access to the current array value and the current copy of the final result value. Here's an example. I have this array of numbers, and I need to find the minimum value in this array. I can do this with the reduce method. Let's define the variable that reduce will eventually end up returning and call it result. Then we'll set that variable to the return value of calling reduce on the array of numbers. Reduce takes 2 arguments, the function used to process the array elements and the value for their final result to start at. I'll call the processing function min and start the minimum at the first value in the array. Now let's define the min function. The min function takes 2 arguments, the current value of the final result and the current array element. I'll call those res and lm respectively. On any given call of this min function, if the current element is smaller than the element you have already set as a minimum value, Then you want to replace that minimum value with the current element. Whatever you return from this min function will be the new current value of the final result. So if we have found lm to be the new minimum, we'll return lm inside the if statement. Otherwise, we'll return res outside the if statement because the minimum value hasn't changed. So if you console log out the result, it ends up being 2 because that was the smallest value in the array. In this example, we want to get an array of the first letter of every person's name in this array. So let's define the final result variable and call it first letters. Then we can call reduce on the people array and pass in the function fl that will get the first letter, and then start the array of first name letters to be an empty array. Now let's define the function fl. fl will take in the letters container and the current person, which I'll call letters and current person respectively. Every time this function is called, we will push on the first letter of the person's name to the letters container. Then we'll return the letters container so it can be the new container for the next run of the function. If you were to console log this out, you'll get the letters A, B, and C for Alf, Brittany, and Charlie. From is a function that copies what you passed in to make a new array. If you pass in a string, every character in that string gets copied into the new array in order. If you pass in an array, every value from the old array gets passed into the new array. If your original array only has primitive types in it, among those being number, string, boolean, and undefined, then the copy operates independent of the original. Changing the 0th element of array B does nothing to the 0th element of array A. If, however, your original array contains an object, only a reference to that object is copied over. A reference is like a memory address, so the original and copy are both working with the same object, meaning changing the name to John in array B has the unintended consequence of also changing the name to John in array A. The array.isArray method in JavaScript is a static method of the array constructor that determines if what you passed in is an array. Why does this method exist? It gives you a concise way to ask in code if the thing is an array. You can't use type of because the type of array is object. You can't use instance of because that wouldn't filter out an object that inherited from an array but isn't itself an array. A string containing what looks like an empty array, null, and the empty object are all not arrays. The empty array and the array constructor with nothing passed into it are both arrays.